The UK is a significant global economy, but it's far from being the biggest, so it doesn't that often make headlines all around the world. But it did this week, although maybe not for the right reasons.
This morning, the British pound plunged nearly 5% to a record low against the US dollar.
The British pound has crashed to a record low against the US dollar.
The British pound hitting an all-time low today against the dollar.
Yeah, so here's what happened. Liz Truss introduced a round of tax cuts for the wealthy, and in response, the British currency has collapsed.
I think the UK is behaving a bit like an emerging market.
Do we have the ingredients required to have that self-fulfilling downward spiral?
I think it's something worse, unfortunately. I don't want it to be worse. This is the country I earn my money in. I'm long sterling, naturally, from my salary.
This is a UK fueling a global development that is resulting in significant damage both to global markets and the global economy.
And then over the weekend, the Chancellor, in a schoolboy era, then says more of this stuff is coming. And so chaos reigns.
Well, I wonder if the new Prime Minister, Liz Truss, was watching. A little earlier, I spoke to the man that some call her favourite economist. That's Gerard Lyons. And I started by asking if the government is right by trying to say this turmoil is primarily down to global forces.
The reality is that there's three different things happening. First, the government is right. The global backdrop is very difficult, very febrile financial markets. Interest rates in the Western economies and borrowing rates in Western economies have risen significantly in recent months. Then second, on top of that, last Thursday, the Bank of England increased interest rates in the UK by not as much as the markets probably had hoped for. But at the same time, the Bank of England said that they were going to be selling gilts over the next year, which the markets didn't like. That added to the supply of government debt. But the third factor in particular was the mini budget. So one has to say of all the events, it was the mini budget that was the most significant, but the backdrop was both those global factors and the Bank of England last Thursday. And in terms of the mini budget, there were lots of good things in the mini budget in terms of aimed at the pro-growth agenda. Confederation of British Industry liked it, the Institute of Directors liked it. But as I warned about beforehand, and as I was worried out on the day, and as the markets are now showing, the markets were not liking the fact that the government borrowed too much. They announced the whole series of measures that the market expected, but then they went that one extra step. They announced some tax changes that the markets were not comfortable with. I think the markets were overly worried about the inflationary implications of those extra tax changes, but in particular, and I can understand that the markets were worried about the affordability, largely because they were not prepared for it. So, for instance, the tax change for higher earners in economic terms was not so significant, but it was like the last straw that broke the camel's back. The Chancellor, while he had focused on the general public and on British businesses, he had not really prepared the financial markets fully. And I think he had taken his eye off the ball slightly, shall we say, in having not prepared the markets for what he was doing in the budget. And I felt that he overstepped the mark last week. So it was the combination of all three factors, the febrile markets because of the global backdrop, the actions of the Bank of England last Thursday. But let's be in no doubt, it was primarily the mini budget last Friday that triggered this latest series of events.
I have to say, listening to you, I am quite struck by the change in the attitude that I am seeing. When we spoke before the budget, it felt to me like you were quite excited about the Liz Truss economic plan. You were excited about the fact that it was going to, in your view, help growth. Now you're saying that the Chancellor has overstepped the mark and there was things in the budget specifically that have frightened the markets. Have you changed your view?
No, let's be quite clear. It was very positive in many respects, the budget or the mini budget last Friday, because the mini budget was very much aimed at a pro-growth agenda. And that's really good. We need to break out of this low growth phase and we need to move to a more supply side driven, investment led agenda. The challenge, though, was that as one moved towards the budget last Friday, particularly given the backdrop internationally and at the Bank of England, as I said, the Bank of England tightening policy, it was vitally important, I would say, that the government or the Chancellor took the financial markets with him. I was writing last week, in particular, and the week before, about the very febrile state of the markets. So coming back to your question, no, there was a whole series of very positive things in the mini budget. But what one needs to say is that if we take three different target audiences, general public, now the mini budget really helped them because by having the energy price cap and by reversing those planned tax increases, corporation tax and national insurance, the combination of all that effectively stopped the economy falling into a potentially very deep recession and stopped things falling into a situation where the public finances would have been blown out of the water. Now, the second target audience was the British business community. And as I say, the CBI, Federation of British Industry, the industry directors were very positive. And that's because there were lots of very pro-investment measures announced in the budget and the marker for further steps in the future. That was really good. But the third group was the markets were very nervous ahead of the budget. Now, if the Chancellor had just stuck to what the markets had expected, which is actually what I thought he was going to do, then it would have all been fine. So in addition to the energy cap, of the additional borrowing, 82 pence in each extra pound borrowed was reversing those two planned tax increases. If it had just been that, it would have been really fine. But what we saw was maybe for whatever reason, the Chancellor just decided to do a little bit more. And in them themselves, you might say each individual item wasn't particularly expensive, but it was the fact that the markets were in the febrile state and they were worried about the affordability, the ability to service the debt, shall we say. So overall, lots of positives. It wasn't communicated well and maybe not handled well at the last minute. But putting it all together, coming back to your question, I think the pro-growth strategy is very good. But what we now have is the aftermath of the events of last week. And what we need to see is a period of stability return to financial markets.
You say that a period of stability is needed. Do you think spending cuts are necessary?
Well, in terms of that, that's not the immediate issue in my mind. Okay. When one looks at fiscal policy, and I'm surprised we're having to wait till late November, the fiscal principles, I think, are very important. Fiscal principles are very much about stabilising the economy in the near term.
So he should do something quicker, you think, then?
Well, actually, last Friday, he announced measures to stabilise the economy in the near term by ruling out the deep recession. But what I'm saying in terms of quicker, in terms of bringing those principles forward, just because if you can, the principles are quite clear. It's about having fiscal discipline, and that's about reducing debt to GDP.
You said that you warned before the budget about the risks of borrowing and also the risk of not taking the market along with the government. You've been described as Liz Truss's favourite economist. Did you have any conversations with her or her team?
Well, obviously the Prime Minister in the last couple of weeks has been preoccupied with other issues. But yeah, I made my thoughts known. Lots of positives about the budget. I obviously didn't know what the detail was going to be in it because I'm not inside the tent, so to speak. But I was highlighting and indeed writing, as you probably have seen, about the febrile state of the markets and the need to keep the markets on side. So within the overall context, the economic story is a positive one, a pro-growth agenda. But there's no doubt that in these sorts of environments, as one saw last week, it was necessary to, particularly as it wasn't a budget that was fully funded, the OBR wasn't giving an announcement. It was therefore very important to get the fiscal principles across last week.
And they didn't take your advice on that.
Yeah. Well, sometimes people listen, sometimes they don't. But there were positives that came out of it. But as we saw last Friday, it was just not keeping things into line with what the markets had been prepped for and were expecting.